Excellent. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you all for being here bright and early this morning. This is, as you can tell, a fantastic panel with a real commitment to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the global goals. And we have a tremendous amount of expertise and leadership on this panel. I was asked to introduce the panelists, which is really not particularly necessary, I think, in this setting. But let me start just by introducing Bill McGlashan, the CEO of TPG Rise, and someone who I've known has had a really deep commitment to global development and addressing poverty through his life. Afsaneh Beschloss, who is the CEO of RockCreek Capital and a former leader at the World Bank, amongst many, many other important roles. Of course, Madame Lagarde does not need an introduction, but Christine, we're excited that you're here and excited to hear from you. President Paul Kagame, who has been our partner and extraordinary leader in Africa, most recently completed his tenure as the chair of the African Union in 2018, and we're thrilled that you are with us. And of course, Bono, who really needs no introduction, but for those of you that...
CMO of U2.
CMO of U2. But for those of you that haven't been paying attention for a couple of decades, has been an exceptional leader in the global fight for justice and equity, bringing data, analytics, advocacy, and policy chops to it with maybe a little bit less visibility than what he does on stage for the band, but perhaps with just as much, if not more, impact for the world's poor. And I'm Shah, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. I think we'll start with just a few opening comments. We established 3.5 years ago the global goals because we know that it's possible to end poverty by 2030. We've seen tremendous progress between 1990 and 2005. Poverty has gone from 37% of total population around the world to today just under 10%. But for us to really address the challenges of extreme poverty and the attendant risks on health, on food, on justice and security for women and girls, on educational opportunities, we know that we need to dramatically increase global investment against these goals and objectives. And so this conversation is really about how do we fill what some have estimated is an annual gap of almost $2.5 trillion a year to get there. And perhaps I could start by asking President Kagame to describe for us, you've led a transformation of the Rwandan economy. You've led the fastest decrease in child and maternal mortality has existed in Rwanda than any other country in the world, certainly in Africa. You have created an infrastructure where most health clinics in Rwanda are now connected by drones, so that blood samples and therapeutics are literally flying to where they need to get to reach those in greatest need. And you recently hosted a process and completed initial commitments to create an African free trade agreement. Are you optimistic that at a time when some people are skeptical about investing in Africa, and at a time when official development assistance has remained flat at around $150 billion a year, are you optimistic that the continent, with leaders such as yourselves, can in fact mobilize the resources to achieve the global goals in Africa?
Well, thank you, Raj, and fellow panelists. To give it a bit of history, first I've been lucky. I benefited from participation. I was part of the formerly what was called MDGs Commission, and we, under the UN at the same time, we learned a lot of lessons from there and got feedbacks from the field, from experts, from people who were involved in looking into mobilizing resources for development for the countries and parts of the world concerned. So that put aside, the SDGs came focusing on a number of things and what can be done, and very specific, and most importantly, bringing together public and private partnership and emphasizing that. And this was with the knowledge that no matter how we calculate the amount of resources required to meet this development gap is huge. And therefore, it could not be just public financing alone to cover that. Most especially the private sector has been very central and has to step in. Then working together has even been more important. Now, lessons one could learn from our own experience, Rwanda, which again answers the question you've raised, and I'm saying people should be hopeful that no matter how big the challenge is, and it is very big, we working together and each participant playing their rightful role and doing it rightly, I think we can make very significant progress, and progress has been made even over time, much as there is still more work to do. And for Rwanda, if Rwanda can do it, we always say anybody else can do it. So we have been able, one, to build institutions that can help us absorb these resources wherever they have come from. In our case, we have had donor funding for most of our activities in development. But what we insisted on right from the outset was that for us in Rwanda, we make sure that every dollar that is coming our way must be put to good use and make sure that it produces what we want or takes us towards where we want. And at the same time, we had to identify key things. One was to build those institutions and mechanisms that would help us deploy the resources we receive, and also worked on matters of governance to make sure that resources don't get lost in other ways that we don't have.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And public resource management and resource mobilization has been a huge part of your success in Rwanda. Christine, I might turn to you and ask you to extend that theme. If you look between 2005 and 2015, domestic resource mobilization for public expenditure in lower and middle income countries has gone from $1.7 trillion to $5.7 trillion. That's, there aren't many places you can look and actually find trillions of dollars. Are those resources, is that going to continue into the future? What's your outlook for growth, for domestic spending, for the quality of governance and the quality of those expenditures and how they're managed?
Well, I would say that first of all, you definitely need growth. And that's the sort of base from which you start. And then you apply, as President Kagame has indicated, the right policies in terms of taxation, in terms of revenue raising of all sorts, and then, even almost more importantly, in terms of efficient spending. Because you can increase domestic revenue mobilization as much as you want. If the revenue that you mobilize is spent poorly on some white elephant projects, then you're wasting your time. So I would say growth first, and our forecast for growth for the low-income and emerging market economies is not bad. It's a little bit revised down, but not much, and we see growth in the coming years from that group of countries. Number two, domestic revenue mobilization needs to increase. There's no question about that. The average, we call it, I'll call it domestic revenue mobilization, easier, not to change names. And please, global goals is nice, but we were just beginning to understand what SDGs were. But domestic revenue mobilization needs to increase. It's roughly at an average of 13%. It's way too low for the spending that is needed in those two groups of countries. And the third point is the most critical one, because you can really save as much as you're going to earn more in domestic revenue mobilization if you do efficient spending. So no white elephant, no corruptions along the lines, and that calls on the governance to be revisited.
Are we getting, in lower and middle income countries, are we getting better or worse when it comes to efficient spending from the perspective of the IMF?
I can't say that because it's so country specific. There are countries where there are significant improvements and where leaders have the courage to lead and to say we're not doing that anymore, we're doing it differently, as has been the case. But in other countries, it is not improving. So, but that's a clear component of the joint effort that will be needed, domestic revenue mobilization, continuation of ODA, and the private sector involvement. Because if the governance is not revisited, those investors are going to turn their nose up and say, no, 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 I'm not investing money there because it's going to be wasted. So efficient spending is a critical component.
Bono, you've been talking about how global development expenditures have become more efficient over time, and we've all been focused on measuring results, delivering results. Official development assistance appears to be stuck at around 150 billion a year. And I don't know if you believe that's going to go up or down or stay flat, but what's your vision for where we are today relative to 15 years ago and how we get to a place where we've really mobilized real resources to achieve these goals?
Well, first, let me thank everybody for getting up early to go and see a panel called Bridging the Financing Gap for the Sustainable Development Goals. I can imagine people just going, come on, honey. This is going to be great. You know, the SDGs does sound like a sexually transmitted disease, doesn't it? And it is amazing that, you know, advertisers spend most of their time trying to make boring ideas look really exciting. But in the development community, we seem to spend most of our time making really exciting ideas look really boring. And it's not boring. This is what real change looks like. And I read, actually, Christine, the IMF's report just recently, which just reminded me that if we didn't have the Sustainable Development Goals, we'd have to invent them. And you know, they're like a report card from the planet's executive branch and telling us how we're doing or how we're not doing and how we might improve. So I'm very grateful to be here, so I just want to say that. On where we're at with solving these problems and bridging that gap, I mean, my particular drive is in a few directions. From the One Campaign's perspective, I think, is Gail Force Smith in the room? Yeah, there she goes. There's our boss. You know, one is concerned with the least developed economies. And I suppose the chance of getting new resources there come from ODA, which is, you've pointed out, is a little stuck. Two, I suppose from local domestic resource mobilization. And again, President Kagame has just done the most remarkable thing. And we're really grateful for what you've done in empowering your health service and lots of other things. And the high-tech nature of it is pretty impressive too. But the third bit, which I think looks like a shapeshift for me, is to talk about the private sector and trying to unlock that kind of power. And to do that, I think we have to just ask ourselves deeper questions about where we are with the project called capitalism. And you know, capitalism is not immoral. It's amoral. It requires our instruction. Capitalism has taken more people out of poverty than any other ism, but it is a wild beast, and if not tamed, it can chew up a lot of people along the way. And in fact, those people's lives that it has chewed up are pushing the politics in our homes towards populism. And so I think we have to, you know, think about the private sector, but we have to have some humility about what we can achieve in the private sector. And so, but if you can unlock it, it's amazing what we can kind of pull off. But it will need a change, and it'll be uncomfortable, perhaps, for people to get there, including jumped up little rock stars.
Well, so let's talk about what it takes to really mobilize private capital to achieve these goals. And Afsaneh, maybe I could turn to you. You've been at the bank. You've obviously been an extremely successful investor, and you've seen funds all around the world in emerging markets. Do you see a lot more capital going into emerging markets? In what ways? And frankly, we all talk about $1 trillion of foreign direct investment going into lower and middle income countries, which sounds like a big number. In your experience, is that number driving the achievement of these goals? To Bono's point of is the ism that defines that fund flow getting more aware?
Thank you, Raj, and nice to be part of this wonderful panel. I think going back to what Bono said, Millennium Goals was the old one that nobody had heard of outside of very special groups in the developing community. And the president, of course, was very involved in that. SDGs you talked about. I think the important thing about the SDGs, when they were crafted, they are incredibly well crafted. At the same time, for the private sector investment world or even the public sector development world, they're hard to translate into an actual investment and then to measure. In fact, I remember when I first joined the World Bank a long time ago, I was asked to measure the poverty impact of an oil pipeline going through an African country. And it was built by foreigners. It was leaking in the country, and it was not bringing any local jobs. So when I went back to my bosses and said, this was literally my first week at the bank, they said, Bob McNamara believes in having numbers, make them up. So I think, as we're working on the SDGs and trying to turn them into reality, very important to do what Dr. Lord Tyson here is doing and others, which is to really find ways to measure and to find real good investments. And I think what is happening that concerns me somewhat is that on the one hand, as you mentioned, there is the big number is 1 trillion. But if you also look at net outflows out of the same countries, those are very large. Just a little bit less than the trillion you mentioned, number one. Number two, one of the things that has concerned me, particularly I would say in the last 2 months, really short term on Africa, is that we're investors in Sub-Saharan Africa, and Rwanda has done an incredible job under the president's leadership. At the same time, we're seeing private sector flows by long-term investors who have always been very present in Africa start to kind of either stop. Some people have actually taken capital off the table. So I think it's really important to see, given the importance of what we're talking about, how can we mobilize assets to go back there?
Well, that's a great lead-in to Bill. Bill, you've done something very special with David Bonderman and your colleagues at TPG around the RISE Fund, and we want to hear about that. The Emerging Markets Private Equity Association just reported that there has been fewer funds that have formed for investments in places like Africa than perhaps in the past few cycles. What are you seeing in private equity oriented around this space? And is it reasonable to think that private equity can really be a part of this solution? It seems like you're going to have to prove that.
Yeah, I mean, when Bono and I and Jeff Skoll set out to start the RISE Fund, the goal was to answer some basic questions that had not been answered. One, could it be done at scale? Could you bring capital at a level that would matter in these markets? Could we get the trillions of dollars of institutional capital to engage that are fiduciaries at the end of the day? Could we deliver collinear outcomes, both social and environmental impact that was measurable, but also returns that are credible for institutions by backing entrepreneurs that are building great businesses that have a great impact? This company that we were all referring to earlier that delivers blood with drones, that in partnership with President Kagame has helped to create the first country in the world where everyone is within 30 minutes of critical medical supplies, is an example of innovation that can be quite profitable but quite impactful at the same time. The challenge remains finding, as a steward of capital, finding situations where the outcomes are truly collinear, where we can deliver credible returns that investors are seeking and credible impact is a challenge. One of the existential issues that had been a real problem was measurement. It was the greenwashing or marketing that people, I think, are appropriately cynical about business. Outside of this community, I think many people, potentially the majority of people, believe business is the problem, not the solution. You know, the populism that Bono referred to earlier. So it's imperative that we not try to have impact, but rather that we actually prove it, deliver impact, proven impact, deal by deal, with credible, real measurement. I think in the act of doing that, there is the potential to unlock a partnership between civil society, philanthropy, and the private sector in a way that has been talked about a lot, but hasn't really been done at scale. You know, there is a common language called impact, called, you know, defined as the sexual transmitted disease, STDs.
Sorry about that.
that is deeply powerful if we have a credible way of engaging that isn't marketing or greenwashing. And I mean, my personal journey began back in Africa and Central America, India, where I lived, seeing the challenge of Africa alone, 15 million jobs required just to keep up with the demographics, and it's going to require all elements coming together in order to achieve those kind of outcomes together.
Raj, can I just support what has just been said? Business has to be part of the solution, because when we look at numbers and how much will be needed to reach by 2030 the Sustainable Development Goals, domestic mobilization will never be able to do that. No way. You know, we've just, I have to take the, you know, we just published today a special report on the actual calculations, you know, the fiscal calculation of what it would take to get to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals on only about 5 of the 17 principles. So we took the key ones: education, health, sanitation, water and roads. You know, basic. For that, it would take, on average, about 4% additional, 4% of GDP additional spending for the emerging markets, and 15% additional spending of GDP for low-income countries. That is monumental. There's no way that, even with the best domestic revenue mobilization, that the public sector does that. So the business has to be part of it. One more thing that I would like to say. I see in my job multiple countries. I'm looking around to see whether there are any of the McKinseys and Boston consulting groups, and if they are, please listen to me. But I see many, many low-income countries and emerging market economies spend millions of dollars commissioning consultants to build their strategic plan. I would highly recommend that some saving be made by taking the 17 principles, the actionable items, start with that, don't reinvent it. It's there is a plan, there are objectives, they've been thought through. And from there, the consultants can actually do the job of putting it into reality, country-specific and blah, blah, blah. But don't reinvent it. It's right there. And it can be adjusted to the country by proper planning, because so much is wasted. That's part of the inefficient spending that I would really suggest can be actually saved.
Yeah, please. Yeah, and could you also describe how because you've attracted technology companies, local entrepreneurship, private venture capital to Rwanda, which would have seemed unheard of, 10 years ago. How did you do that?
Yes, I'll come to that. Let me say for both questions, a couple of things. One, I agree. The domestic tax revenue mobilization is only important in as far as it can be increased to feel, at least to make sure that no one is left behind in the country. It fills those gaps that remain even when you have been successful with private investment mobilization. So that is key. Number two is what I wanted to add, what you have just said, with SDGs. In fact, like in Rwanda, we have a SDGs center to serve the African continent. And what it does, it looks at what you've just been talking about, and we advise governments. Because some of it they are already doing, but they are doing in a haphazard way. And therefore, the SDGs Center helps them understand how to align things properly so that they continue. So I agree, there is a lot of information and things we can actually build on, instead of hiring all kinds of consultancies for that. So, but back to the point, what we have tried to do, we looked at the basic infrastructure and the foundation to put in place so that we can easily mobilize private capital to come to Rwanda. We did several investments at the same time. One was invested in education and health, as was said, then infrastructure that would provide the kind of backbone on which entrepreneurs, people who have innovative ideas, can build on to do what they want to do. Second, we also looked at the sort of business environment we need to put in place. We didn't invent most of the things. We looked at elsewhere how things work, what makes them work, and we tried to do that within our own possibilities and means. Therefore, we had the donor capital coming in, funding coming in, then we had the private investments coming in because we created that conducive environment to attract the investments that were required. So this is the area, and things
as a result, what's the growth rate in Rwanda?
I'll tell you, for the last 15 years, it has between 7 and 8% every year,
Which is
one
how
of the top performers.
Which is how you get that compounded effort in reducing poverty and increasing domestic expenditure.
Yes. So we have seen a consistent growth.
But you said one thing. You did say that the public expenditure is really for the most vulnerable part of the population. Yes. And Bono, one of the things you and others have done so successfully with One and everybody else is generate an environment where the Global Fund could help 17.5 million people with HIV get treatment, 5 million people get treated for tuberculosis. We're not done yet with those battles, and we are facing replenishments for the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, for Gavi, for some other efforts that we just know work. Are we going to meet our goals? I think the Global Fund's trying to raise $14 billion in perhaps the most populist and challenging political environment since Glen Eagles. What is your call to action for those in this room around some of those important causes that do support the most vulnerable amongst us?
I mean, that's our daily toil at the One campaign. And we've 10 million members now, 3 million of them in Africa, which is amazing. And I think the membership in Africa will drown out the membership north of the equator eventually. So we're very proud of what's happening with One under Gail's leadership. But there are specific battles up ahead. And, we picked a fight with this illness, HIV, AIDS, greatest health crisis in 600 years and whatever. And there were illnesses that were perhaps cheaper to approach. Bill Gates would talk to you about pneumococcal or whatever, river blindness, whatever. We picked a fight with HIV AIDS because the 2 pills a day that kept you alive or didn't, if you couldn't get them, sort of physicalized inequality. They didn't just symbolize it, they physicalized it. So we could go to work on that. And you had this cross-party, right and left, got together in the US, around the world, and took on this disease and was winning. We were winning. And then we've been somewhat put on the back foot by a, you might say, understandable concern in northern economies that we have problems in our own cities. There's homeless on the streets of our own cities. Why should we care about what's happening over there? Now, there are very good reasons to care for what's happening over there. And I don't think there's anybody in Europe now, even people who are not interested in development, who don't think what's going on in Africa affects them. In fact, we know that if Africa is not successful, Europe cannot succeed. If Africa fails, Europe cannot succeed. But so we have to sort of reinvigorate these movements. Now, we've done it by working with companies also, with the Red campaign. That's how we did it, this phone. Yeah. And people say, oh, that's a nice looking phone, and I've got them. So I can then bend their ear talking about this. So you have a $14 billion replenishment coming up. Is Peter
we should
Sands
say
here?
this phone is part of the RED campaign.
Oh, sorry, this phone is part of the RED campaign. If Apple have given a fortune to fight this disease. If you see Tim Cook wandering around, I didn't even know he was coming.
Or if you're going to buy buy a red one.
And just tell him thank you. But back to and Bank of America are here. Where's there you go. So Anne Finucane's there. So yes, Bank of America give a lot of cash to the Global Fund, which is really incredible through RED. And actually, where the politics get interesting is she's 17,000 branches of Bank of America. And on World AIDS Day, they go red. And everybody is reminded of this. The excitement of this campaign to rid the world of this tiny little virus that caused so much havoc in so many people's lives. But now the rubber hits the road. We've got a replenishment. We had Trudeau, President Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau really rolled up his sleeves, got busy. We have President Macron now, who wants to do even better. Looking at this 14 minutes, that's a hard lift. And we're humbled by his passion on this. But it requires the public. Politics is what is popular. That is what, so we have to get back into the conversation. And we won't get back into the conversation if we don't also have some sort of response to what's going on in our own cities. So that's kind of where I'm at with this.
To be generous abroad, we do need to be strong at home. I've always been wowed by the One Campaign videos when they interview people across America in particular and say, do you know that there are 1,000 young girls and women today that are going to get HIV/AIDS, and that we have a system in place where for a few dollars a year per capita, we can solve that problem.
But we're losing, I mean, honestly, we could lose this thing. You know, we could be, defeat from the jaws of victory. You have 7,000, by the way, girls getting this disease every week. That's 1,000 a day. And twice as likely young women than young men, which is mind-blowing, really. And but back, can I just say something about the business stuff?
Yeah.
Because the same people, the young people who are driving the One campaign, they're driving changes in business. They really are. They're not loyal to brands, and they're loyal to ideas. The millennials, there's lots of data on this. And I would say that businesses, even great businesses, like species, if they don't, they can be extinct if they don't adapt and evolve. And there's a new mood in the room, and I think we need to be sensitive to what it is.
Have you seen that, Bill? Have you seen, TPG Rise has been measuring the impact of investments and has that as a filtered criteria. You have investments in companies like We Analytics that are helping to advance the development cause. Does that motivate the staff in a different way, and does that allow you to attract millennial talent in a more effective manner?
We've both commented that it's a very luxurious, in light of that sentiment, it's a luxurious place to invest, because we find that millennials in general no longer want to separate making a living from contributing. They want to integrate those two priorities together, do well by doing good. In general, I've never in 25 years of being actively investing in companies all around the world, I've never seen a greater attractor than what we're doing with the Rise Fund, investing with this impact mandate, because they align with that agenda. And anyone that's been investing realizes that's where millennials are. Even as investors, if I talk at places like Stanford and Harvard Business School, the level of interest that these young career-oriented people have in engaging in this journey is profound. So I think the debate about whether people want business to be on the side of good is over. I do think just as species can go extinct, businesses will go extinct if they don't get on the side of authentic good, and this does need to be measured. I think one of the problems with these kind of sentiments is it becomes a honeypot to market to, and that's a real danger. So we need to hold ourselves humbly accountable to not overstate and actually ultimately deliver on the promise that this incredible engine of innovation and durability and scalability that is business can do to solve these otherwise intractable problems that we're facing.
So, Afsaneh, you advise a lot of pension and institutional investors around the world and in the United States. Do you tell them what Bill just said? Do you say the time has come for you to really be hard-nosed, serious, quantitative about allocations that are committed to these objectives? And by the way, you should hold your fund managers or whoever you're giving resources accountable to deliver results and measure that and report on it?
It is definitely part of the big message. I think what is very interesting, though, is even some of the boards I'm on, what you'll find is that the chief investment officer, if you mention the word impact or ESG or sustainability or SDGs, their eyes will glaze over. The first impression is it means no return. The mission-oriented group will be very excited, but not the endowment people who actually control the asset allocation. And I think part of what we do, and both at the bank and you and I have talked about sort of creating this marketplace for impact, which covers everything. Yeah. Because private equity is very important. At the same time, private equity is probably only $1 trillion in emerging markets altogether out of the 66 trillion in assets in emerging markets. So very important to get other sources of capital to these areas. You need long-term assets, whether it's infrastructure or whatever. But for example, one of the messages that we share and actually invest in every day is health and edtech in emerging markets. Those are some of the highest return areas. And you talked about leapfrogging. What we're finding is that in emerging markets, the fastest growing area and the best returns are from the health sector, for all the reasons we talked about. Part of the health sector is obviously for social programs. But in terms of areas that can help the poor and the middle class and everybody else in the country, we've invested across so many public and private areas. Health sector used to be 1% of MSCI in EM. Now it's getting close to 4 to 5%. Imagine it will double. Yeah. In the US, it's close to 18%. So just look at the room it has. EdTech, which will be life-changing in emerging markets, will be another very, very important area to watch.
Well, I've heard two call to actions just now. Bono, your point about, if we let down the 1,000 girls that are going to get HIV today simply because we're not paying attention anymore.
Or we're leaving it too much to the private sector. That's what we need.
Or we're not putting enough courage into our public commitments. That would be a huge failure, and I think it's incumbent on everyone in this room to carry that message forward. And Bill and Afsaneh, in those comments, you point out that the private sector has an important role to play, but it's got to be real, it's got to be measured. It can't just be, well, CSR is not the right frame, but it can't just be marketing. It's got to be serious, and that there are serious opportunities that you've both uncovered.
Right.
Christine, I wonder if you...
There has to be good governance.
Well, I wanted to come to you on that, because you said, okay, even with all that, we need, in low-income countries, a 15% of GDP increase in terms of public investment done well. You're advising governments all the time, and of course we have President Kagame here, who we all appropriately have learned from for an example of how to beat corruption, how to have a plan, how to execute, and how to succeed economically. But there aren't that, everyone is not President Kagame. So what is your vision or your call to action for that problem?
And I was going to say, with all due respect to him and great admiration, not everybody should be like President Kagame, because each country is going to have its own specificity, its own characteristics, its own resources, its own dependencies. I mean, if you look at Rwanda, it's a landlocked country. It's one that has recently taken major initiatives in terms of pan-African trade and which is pushing initiatives to make infrastructure more intra-regional. So you look at Ghana, it's another story. You look at Côte d'Ivoire, it's another story. You look at Vietnam, it's another story. And yet all those countries have to make similar efforts, which they can do some, but where clearly other financing tools have to come in. we've been talking a lot about the private sector and the business coming in, and it's critically important. I think ODA is something where we are short of the 0.7% that was committed. I know Bono has said that multiple times, but if we measure it, we're short of 230 billions per year.
Just on that.
Yeah.
Just on that.
Yeah.
And 34 billion of the current 150 or 160 billion is the only proportion that goes to the lowest income countries.
Absolutely, because
So
it's not
the
going
idea
in the
that-
right places.
Yeah,
are
we
the most
celebrate a capital
needy.
increase for the World Bank, but much of that is for the IBRD lending window that goes to companies that have access to credit.
But Raj, to your point, I think solid governance and an effort at the leadership level to sustain the effort of good governance, because it takes time to, change practices and to really make it hospitable for private sector and for ODA to come in and to invest properly. Second, better tax collection, revenue mobilization, and the bank, the fund, everybody is trying to provide technical assistance to improve on that. And I can't insist enough on that, efficient spending. The difference between the inefficient spending and the efficient spending is very significant and equal to how much additional revenue can be mobilized with the proper system.
So with that insight, what's your call to action to folks in this room?
I would say you've borrowed Yates, I'm borrowing you, Bono. In dreams begin responsibility.
Wow.
I would say in dreams begin responsibility and solidarity is self-interest. I'll give you one example. Chancellor Merkel, we haven't talked about her today, but she's really pushed the initiative with Bono's help, with one's help, to actually do the compact with Africa. And that was a call to action for private sectors to look at the African countries in particular, and a cooperative effort with the African leaders to actually redirect towards African countries investments that would be conducive to growth and to better being and to more investment at public level on health and education. What has happened? The German private sector listened and made quite a few investments, but not a lot has happened elsewhere. And yet she had that call to action at a much higher level than Germany. So I would say that it concerns everyone. It has to be a collective project.
Can I say
while you do that, we're going to also ask members of the audience who want to ask a question have that opportunity. So please put your hand up and someone will bring you a microphone.
Mine was just a complete tangent just on what Madame Lagarde has done with the IMF. And I just wanted for people to know that as an activist years ago, I thought of the IMF as a great Satan. And I'm not joking about that. I really did, and because there's sort of structural adjustment and the sort of bullying of junior economies was prevalent. I remember going to meet, who was your former, the French?
Camdessus.
Camdessus. And I remember going to see him, and I was expecting Satan to welcome me. And this very sweet Frenchman with like Buddhist beads was, hello, can I help you? And I said, well, not me, but there's lots to do. And you really, I just want to say, we in the development community, we really value your tough-mindedness and all of that. It's really good, and as I said, we'll still be on your case, but
sure, please.
Questions from the audience.
Raj, could I just jump in with what Madame Lagarde said about governance also? I think one of the very important roles in terms of governance also for the IMF, which you're doing already in terms of what the technical assistance you're doing, but for the bank and IFC also, is make the capital markets, help drive the capital markets to become more efficient. The costs of doing transactions in the countries are very high. A lot of the infrastructure for the capital markets is still deficient. In fact, President Kagame has done a great job in Rwanda for investors, but you really need that to spread because we need the roads, but we should think of the capital markets, the roads also there to be built. And it's a very important role where much more important than a single dollar. Nobody else can do that except the government with the aid of the IMF and the World Bank and IFC, because you're seeing a lot of the best cases and the worst cases. The cost of transacting in Zimbabwe for one stock is 4%. So how much return do you need to make to just cover that cost? before you make any other return.
Yeah. And Zimbabwe is also an example of,
other issues
yes, related to governance. But we have 2 questions from behind you, and I will ask now we have lots of questions. Okay, let's take one there, and then we'll come here to the woman in the front row.
Hi, good morning to all. I'm Armstrong. I'm from India. I work as a civil servant in my country. I come from a state which in the last 10 years back, we had the highest rate of HIV prevalence in India. So I come from the States. Now, my little suggestion is, in a resource deficit state like where I come from and in a developing nation like India, we're getting lots of funding from the ADBs and the World Bank and other financial institutions. Now, if the world institutions are so caring, like we all discuss about eliminating HIV spread, malaria, and others, so what about sanctioning a certain % of the developmental fund? Suppose if you're giving 100 rupees, you make it a mandatory point to spend at least 1-2 rupees on stopping the HIV and others. So if the financial institution in the world can segregate, make it mandatory to segregate at least 1 or 2% of the developmental fund that comes along and make it mandatory for the receiving state to make it a part of the health campaign, I think it's going to be very effective.
Christine, can you take that? Should multilateral development banks and others demand more of an allocation towards these types of human capital investments, including health?
I'm not really well positioned to do that because we're not a development bank. Yeah. And actually, you might take that question because you were development bank. I don't know how it works.
It's sort of, I think, earmarking. It may not be, from an economist's point of view, Dr. Tyson might be able to comment on that better. As an economist, I'd say it's probably not the most efficient way to allocate because, again, you do need capital to move in the right areas. But again, some of the assets that are going are naturally moving into the areas you were talking. But I'm not a big proponent of earmarking personally.
Okay. Marianne?
Thank you. Marianne Hancock with Y Analytics. I know that several folks can comment on this. Afsaneh, you mentioned the institutional investors and the chief investment officer skepticism. What do you think will change their minds?
I think information and data will be extremely important. Raj and I have talked about this for years and years. And I think that information, once it becomes sort of very clear and transparent and easily accessible to people, will be the best way to change people's mind. They'll decide for themselves.
I look to my forum colleagues. Do we have time for a few more questions? We do. Okay, good. Let me come back here just to make sure we're getting anyone. Laura.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question based on your operations already. We've heard a lot about the importance of efficiency and of good governance. So you're already making investment decisions. What are the most important, widely agreed upon measures of impact in areas like governance? I mean, so there's a lot of work going on in impact, and the RISE Fund has done some, and Y Analytics is going to do some, and the IFC is doing some, and the IMF has done some, among others. I'm just wondering, what do we know right now in terms of the particular ones that have been called out here?
Yeah.
How do you judge efficiency, corruption, and these decisions?
Well, it's interesting because when Christine was speaking, I was resonating completely with the need for this combination partnership of governance and real focus on governance, because for us as investors, by the way, I should just comment that the RISE Fund is surrounded by $15 trillion of capital from the biggest pension funds, sovereign funds in the world who have never done impact investing before. So part of our mandate was let's bring them into the fold. One sort of derivative answer to Marianne's question, let's show them the collinearity between returns and impact, and the fact that you can, in fact, without having your eyes roll back in your head, you can actually make this a dual priority, a credible dual priority, and we're well along the journey of convincing of that, given the demand from institutional capital for this kind of offering. But interestingly, not everywhere in the world is investable for us. Our challenge in part is we have to deliver top quartile returns to these same fiduciaries who are insisting that's a necessary minimum. And it's really hard to do that if you don't have an environment like Rwanda where you can rely on rule of law and transparency and the court system to protect you against the challenges of ill governance. And I think it's a necessary, but insufficient, but absolutely necessary enabler at a fundamental level. I mean, Mo Ibrahim is part of our, as part of the founders board of the Rise Fund, is one of our partners, and he puts a lot of his effort into creating a transparent lens on governance on the continent. And this is one of the top priorities to allow us to do realize the partnership potential that we've all been talking about here between civil society and the private sector and philanthropy. Absent basic governance, it's a it's an impossible journey, and certainly not one that we could be part of as fiduciary investors. So it's the right challenge.
Christine.
If I can follow up on Laura's question, we don't really know how to measure the output in terms of good governance. So it's often in many countries anecdotal feedback, business community responses, and da-da-da-da. What we know is that there are particular points where the framework, the legal system, the mechanism by which procurement are allocated, for instance, will inevitably almost be conducive to poor governance. So at least we can identify those hot points where we can say, you need to change that, because that's open door to help yourself.
Let me make one other just hopeful comment. Is we funded a company in the Rise Fund called Cellulant, which is a company in 12 different countries in Africa. They went after a project in Nigeria using blockchain and a digital identity solution. They connected 1.5 million farmers, small stakeholder farmers, with the $500 million a year of aid that's distributed to them for the purpose of buying seeds and fertilizer. It's a very profitable business, but they got in between what was otherwise a corrupt distribution of that 500 million that was ultimately 500 down to 40 million by the time it got to the farmer. Now 500 is 500, and the effect is a 30% uplift in household income for 1.2 million farmers. So there is a role to play for business, even in the context of an overt corruption like that, given technology, mobility, cloud solutions, analytics, that is quite hopeful in providing a pathway, even when you don't have a governance environment that necessarily provides that support.
Right. On this point, I think, very importantly, again, some of the things you're doing at Rockefeller Foundation also, there is what we talked about. We're talking about sort of institutional investors all over the globe, the multilaterals. But what is going to be really going to change the world is the local entrepreneurs. It is, the accelerators that are getting created in Africa. It's good to have YC in California and going all over the world, but you really have to depend on the youth and the millennials in the countries to take the SDGs and run with them. And I think that should be part of what we're sort of connecting the dots. That's at RockCreek, that's what we think we should be doing at the IMF. That's what you're doing at the,
Well, and I would argue that the best, most effective, whether it's World Bank, USAID, other kind of developmental programs of the last 15 years have tried to do that, whether it's identifying hotspots in cross-border trade in Africa and really fighting corruption at those border crossings, or whether it's building farm-to-market roads that help feed the future or Agra farmers market their crops and gain more from it. It's making those connections between public and private that make all the difference. And we only have a couple of minutes left, so we're going to go around, and I do want to hear your final thought on this, but in the following way. I think it is easy. It's easy for me as someone who's been, as Bono once mentioned, on this train for a long time. It's easy to be discouraged by the headlines, and it's easy to see ups and downs in what feel like our commitments to those who are most vulnerable around the world. And sometimes it can be, these were phenomenally important examples, it can be hard to believe that private investment will solve everything, because it won't. And we know we have to maintain both public and private and expand on both fronts. And so it can be hard to be relentlessly optimistic that we're going to achieve these goals and stamp out poverty through this project, this big global project. And I'd love to just hear from you. why are you optimistic, and do you have any other call to action for folks in this room, at Davos, around the world? President Kagame, we can start with you.
I'm very optimistic in a sense that the message is clear to all of us, and Africa is the most concerned in this discussion, I also guess, with the sustainable development goals. If you look at the kind of reforms going on across the continent, even with the Continental Free Trade Area, comes as a result of that, meaning Africa is coming together on some of these important issues that matter. For example, we have to make sure that Africa argues its case if it is to get investments that are required, building on their domestic mobilization of revenues and so on. So, and this has to do with the scale. If you are going to invest in Africa and you are thinking of countries, 20, 30, 40 countries with a certain commonality that allows these investments to take place in a much bigger market, I guess this is going to work.
It's more attractive.
So it's more attractive. So these are things that are happening, and the message is clear. Well, some countries are doing better than others. They are not at the same level, but I think there has been good progress. Second, building on what Christine said, you see, it's not an issue of one wanting to be like the other. It won't happen. It doesn't work. In fact, in the past, the problem has been that there have been people across the world who have been instructing others to be like them, and it hasn't worked. So we've learned lessons. So, but instead, people need to work together. It is cooperation that is required, and everyone makes progress through that. So I think there is a reasonable level of optimism. And if you look at how across the continent people are preparing investment climates within their countries, some ahead of others still lagging behind, but trying to make progress. And the level of governance, progress again in those countries, I think it is cause for optimism, and we can only keep trying our best and again working together and
working
making
together.
Sure that, yes.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Christine.
I echo that 100%. Joining hands, because it will take all of us. And I would add, in youth, I trust, because when we do fiscal hackathon in African countries, when we do special contests, when we do conferences with young people, it's just unbelievable the level of generosity, absolute faith and trust in diversity, and that matters a lot, and innovation and ability to actually transform their dreams into reality. But we have to join hands to support them.
Afsaneh?
I echo everything that was said, but also I think, as Madame Lagarde said, the local entrepreneurs really, really key to the success, together with the policymakers and everyone else. But we also are seeing some of that. If you look at Africa payment systems, they're leapfrogging. They're ahead of us here in the US. So let's see what other areas they can jump ahead.
I've seen firsthand the power of those entrepreneurs to actually make meaningful, real change. And I'm optimistic that as a community of government, business, and philanthropy, we can actually construct a measurement system that will allow us to discern the good, the bad, and the gooder options available to us, and actually direct capital in a way that can efficiently solve these extraordinary issues: climate change, education, financial services inclusion that we're facing as a society. And I'm, having seen it happen, granted at a smaller scale, it gives me great hope.
Thank you. Bono.
I'll run with Christine, and just listening to my own children, and I've just a sense that there's a generation coming, and they're on the train. I think we either get on with them or we're under the train. And I think they're full of firepower. They are not held hostage to ideology. I think they're looking for problem solvers from their politicians. And I think they look to leaders, business leaders or political leaders or singers in rock bands, and they have a question on their mind. You know, are you a firefighter or are you an arsonist? And I think we have to ask ourselves hard questions about which of them we're on. I know which I want to be, but I might need a change of uniform. Or something.
Firefighters or arsonists is an excellent note on which to end this conversation. I will say I retain optimism because of this type of discussion. At the end of the day, I've just seen the power of leadership make a huge difference, whether it's an unpaid woman running a health clinic in rural Senegal who doesn't get paid, you know, is tracking vaccine vials to make sure they're still good, is keeping logs to make sure every child in the neighborhood, in the village, is getting vaccinated, and is doing that because of her extraordinary commitment to her community. She is as much a firefighter and a leader as the big G8 summits that you've had such an extraordinary influence on, where we say we set a goal of 0.7, achieving it is $230 billion. Most of that should go to the most vulnerable countries and communities amongst us, and it's not happening, so we're going to keep fighting for that. And as much as we see leadership in the private sector, on this panel, but also in this room and in this community, where we say, yeah, this is hard. Yes, institutional investors have to, you know, be convinced, but there are great examples, and we're making real progress, and our journey continues. So thank you very much for your commitment as leaders and the example you have set, and for making us all be optimistic about the fact that we can, in fact, achieve these great goals and objectives.
And thank you for your humility, considering where you've come from, and your ability to break things down to people and places and keep us from the abstract. We really appreciate you running this panel.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.